Ever catch yourself when you're in the middle of a conversation and you suddenly realize you're not really saying what you mean, but more like what you think the other person wants to hear? Yeah, that quiet moment, that's self-abandonment. It doesn't come with alarms or neon signs. It comes quietly. When we smile while we're actually hurt, when we stay silent when something doesn't feel okay, or when we keep shrinking parts of ourselves just to hold on to someone. It's subtle, it's soft, but over time it chips away at who we are. And I know this because I've done it. Not once, not twice, but enough times to call it a pattern. And if we're being honest, many of us are experts in it. Not because we're weak or broken, but because somewhere along the line we learn that pleasing others equals staying safe, that approval is survival. But what happens when we stop being ourselves just to be loved? That's what I want to talk about today, the subtle ways we self-abandon in relationships, because most of the time we don't even notice we're doing it until the cost becomes too high. We disown our needs to keep the peace. This one's tender because it often comes wrapped in good intentions. We tell ourselves we're being kind, we're being flexible, we don't want to make things harder, but what we're really doing is making it harder for ourselves. I've seen this in so many conversations, especially with people who are incredibly empathetic. They're the ones who bend and bend until they forget they're allowed to have needs of their own. Maybe it starts with something small. You're tired, but your partner wants to go out, and instead of saying, I really need to rest tonight, you say, sure, let's go. You're hurt by a comment, but instead of naming it, you laugh it off and change the subject. You feel disconnected, but you tell yourself, it's not a big deal, at least we're not fighting. That phrase, at least we're not fighting, has probably held more unspoken pain than any argument ever could. We learn to equate peace with silence, but peace without truth isn't peace, it's pretending. And I want to say this as clearly as possible. Honoring your needs isn't selfish, it's relational integrity. When we habitually swallow what we feel, when we become hyper-focused on someone else's comfort at the expense of our own clarity, we're not creating harmony, we're creating imbalance. And that imbalance builds over time until one day something tiny sets off something huge and no one knows why. There's some really compelling research around this. Studies show that emotional suppression, especially in close relationships, leads to higher levels of chronic stress, anxiety, and even physical health issues. When we consistently deny our own feelings for the sake of others, our bodies carry that burden. It doesn't just go away. It gets stored, sometimes in our chest, sometimes in our gut, sometimes in the weight we feel every time we step into a room where we can't fully be ourselves. And here's the double bind. A lot of us learned that speaking up led to conflict. Maybe in childhood, voicing your needs meant being told you were difficult or dramatic. Maybe in past relationships, asking for emotional connection got twisted into you're too needy. So we adapted. We learned how to be accommodating. We learned how to anticipate what everyone else needed, and we got really good at disappearing in the process. But here's the cost. When we don't express our needs, we don't give the other person the opportunity to meet them. We rob the relationship of the chance to grow in trust and depth, and we begin to build invisible walls, not out of anger, but out of unspoken pain. Now, I'm not talking about throwing every emotion on the table all the time. This isn't about oversharing or demanding. It's about being in relationship with ourselves as much as we are with others. Because if I can't name what I need, how can I expect anyone else to understand me? And yes, sometimes we'll speak our truth and it won't be received perfectly, but the act of showing up for ourselves, that's where trust begins. It's the daily, quiet practice of saying, I matter too. And that's not drama, that's dignity. We abandon our boundaries in the name of love. This one stings, doesn't it? Because when we think about love, we don't want to think about limits. We want to believe that love means giving without measure, showing up no matter what, saying yes because we care. But somewhere along the way, that idea of love got tangled with a really dangerous belief that to be loved, we have to be available all the time, agreeable all the time, and selfless to the point of disappearing. Let me be real with you. I've done this. I've said yes when every part of me was screaming no. I've smiled and nodded, thinking, it's fine, it's not worth it, when really I was just afraid that saying no would make me less lovable. And what I've learned, not just in my research, but in my lived experience, is that every time we abandon a boundary, we abandon a little piece of ourselves. Oh, here's the truth. Love that requires the erosion of your self-respect isn't love. It's sacrifice without connection. Now, boundaries are not walls. They're not about pushing people away or punishing them. Boundaries are the space where love and respect can coexist. They say, I can love you and still say no. I can care about you deeply and still need space. I can support you and still choose what's right for me. That's healthy, that's sustainable, and that's how relationships thrive. But most of us didn't grow up with that kind of blueprint. We grew up watching people either blow past each other's limits or disappear into silence. Maybe setting boundaries in your house meant conflict. Maybe the idea of saying, I need a break was met with guilt. Or don't be selfish. So we learn to equate boundaries with rejection. We learn to equate limits with loss. And yet, the absence of boundaries doesn't bring people closer. It breeds resentment. It's quiet at first. You say yes to the dinner you don't want to go to the favor you didn't have the bandwidth for, to the conversation that drains you. You tell yourself it's fine, it's just this once, but it's never just once, is it? Because the more you override yourself, the more it becomes the norm. And then one day you're exhausted, bitter, and don't recognize the version of yourself that keeps showing up for everyone but you. Research shows that people with strong boundaries are actually more compassionate and more present in their relationships. Why? Because they're not running on empty. They're not giving from a place of depletion. They're giving with clarity and choice. And yes, setting boundaries can be uncomfortable, especially if you're not used to it, especially if you're worried about how someone will react. But discomfort is not the same as disconnection. In fact, sometimes the most loving thing we can do is be honest about what we can and cannot give. That kind of clarity builds trust. It builds safety, not just for the other person, but for ourselves. So if you've been telling yourself, if I don't bend, they'll leave, I want you to know this. You shouldn't have to abandon yourself to be loved, because the people who truly see you, who truly love you, won't just tolerate your boundaries, they'll honor them. We edit ourselves to stay accepted. This one's deep and it's sneaky because it's not always loud or dramatic. It doesn't show up like a full-blown identity crisis. It shows up in little moments that seem harmless at first. You're in a conversation and someone says something you don't agree with, but you nod anyway. You're proud of something you've done, but you downplay it because you don't want to seem like you're bragging. You laugh at the joke that doesn't sit right. You say you're okay when you're not. That's editing. That's the slow, subtle way we shave off the edges of who we are so we can be more palatable, more acceptable, less likely to be judged or misunderstood. And it makes sense. Most of us grew up with some version of this message. Be good, be likable, don't make waves. We learned early that being fully ourselves sometimes came with a cost. Maybe it meant being called too sensitive, too serious, too emotional, too loud, too much. Or maybe we were ignored when we expressed something real. So over time, we got smart. We adapted. We learned to say what people wanted to hear. We learned to perform belonging instead of risking authenticity. The problem is when you edit yourself long enough, you start to lose track of the original version. And that's not just a poetic truth, it's a psychological reality. There's research that shows that self-concealment, especially in close relationships, leads to lower self-esteem, increased anxiety, and a sense of isolation, even when we're surrounded by people. Think about that. You can be loved by others and still feel completely alone if the version of you they're loving isn't real. It's a kind of emotional dissonance, being known and not known at the same time. You're in the room, you're participating, but you're not really seen. And the pain of that runs deep, because no matter how much someone validates the version of you that you've curated, some part of you knows they don't actually know me. And here's the hardest part. We often don't realize we're doing it. Editing becomes automatic. It's the survival strategy that doesn't look like survival. It looks like charm, politeness, ease, but underneath that smooth surface is often fear. Fear of being too complex, too imperfect, too needy. So we trade depth for safety. But connection without depth is just proximity. It doesn't feed us. It doesn't transform us. And listen, I'm not saying we have to spill every truth in every moment. I'm not talking about radical vulnerability all the time. What I am saying is that if you never feel fully expressed in your relationships, if you're constantly walking on tiptoe around who you really are, then that's not belonging, that's performing. Real belonging starts with being able to say, here I am, this is me, all of it. Even if that means risking misunderstanding, even if it means not being everyone's cup of tea. Because the moment you stop editing yourself, you give others permission to meet you, not the polished version, not the edited draft, but the real, breathing, beautiful story of who you are. And if they can't hold that, let them go. Because losing someone who only knows the edited you is not the same as being truly lost. We prioritize connection over authenticity. This one's tough because connection is sacred. It's at the very heart of our emotional survival. We are wired for it. Every single one of us longs to feel seen, heard, and understood. That longing is so strong, so primal, that sometimes we'll trade our truth just to keep that thread of connection alive. We'll smile when we want to cry, agree when we want to object, stay when our gut is whispering to leave, not because we're weak or manipulative, but because disconnection feels terrifying. It can feel like rejection, like abandonment, like danger. So we compromise, not in the healthy, collaborative way, but in the slow erosion way. We start to mold ourselves around the comfort of others. We anticipate what they need before they ask. We tiptoe around our own discomfort because we're afraid that being fully ourselves might push someone away. And here's the hard part. Sometimes it does. Sometimes when we start telling the truth about what we feel, what we value, what we need, not everyone can meet us there. And that is heartbreaking. But the alternative, choosing connection that depends on self-abandonment, that kind of connection isn't real. It's not rooted in truth. It's a performance, a tightrope walk, a never-ending calculation of what's acceptable, and it leaves us lonelier than solitude ever could. What I've found in both research and experience is this: people who consistently choose authenticity over connection are actually the ones most deeply connected. It's just that their connections are built on honesty, not compliance. And that kind of connection may be fewer and farther between, but it's real, it's sturdy, it can handle hard conversations, uncomfortable truths, and seasons of change, because it was never built on pretending in the first place. When we prioritize connection over authenticity, we may gain approval, but we lose intimacy. And intimacy is what we're really hungry for, not just being liked, but being known. Not just being around people, but being seen and loved for who we actually are. And that kind of closeness only comes when we're brave enough to say, this is my truth, even if it's messy. This is who I am, even if it's not always convenient. I've had to learn this the hard way. There were times in my life when I thought I was deeply connected, only to realize I had built a web of relationships where I was showing up polished, agreeable, and half present. And the moment I started bringing more of my full self, my awkwardness, my uncertainty, my strong opinions, that's when the relationships that could truly hold me started to rise to the surface. The others, they faded. And yes, that was painful, but what came after was real, deep, solid. It's not about being authentic all the time in every situation. It's about choosing in the moments that matter most to stay true to ourselves, because when we prioritize authenticity, we create the kind of connection that doesn't require us to disappear to stay loved. We show up whole, we let others do the same. And that is what turns connection into something sacred. We silence our intuition to avoid discomfort. This one's quiet, but it's powerful. And if I'm being honest, it's the one that used to trip me up the most, because intuition doesn't scream. It whispers, it nudges, it gives you that feeling in your gut or that tightness in your chest that says something's off here. And when we're not used to trusting ourselves, when we've been taught to prioritize harmony, politeness, or logic over inner knowing, we push that feeling down. We rationalize. We tell ourselves, don't overreact. Don't make it a big deal. Just keep the peace. But here's the cost. Every time we silence our intuition, we silence a part of our truth. There's this misconception that intuition is vague or unreliable, like it's just emotion dressed up in mystery. But what I've come to understand through years of research and lived experience is that intuition is actually a form of deep inner wisdom. It's the pattern recognition of our nervous system. It's our body picking up on signals, on tone, tension, history, experience before our minds can catch up, and it's usually right. But trusting it requires courage, because it often points us toward discomfort. It tells us when to ask the hard question, when to have the awkward conversation, when to step back from something that no longer feels aligned. Even when there's no obvious proof that anything is wrong, in relationships, silencing our intuition usually sounds like, I'm probably just being too sensitive, or they didn't mean it that way, or it's fine, it's not worth bringing up. And on the surface, that can look like being easygoing or agreeable, but underneath, there's often a steady drip of self-doubt and emotional disconnection. Because when we consistently override what we feel in order to avoid conflict or discomfort, we teach ourselves that our inner voice isn't trustworthy. And once that voice gets quiet, we start looking outward for clarity we already have inside. There's a vulnerability in following your intuition, especially when it doesn't make sense to anyone else, especially when it means disrupting what looks like stability. But choosing discomfort over disconnection from self is a practice of deep integrity. It's a way of saying, I may not have all the answers, but I trust myself enough to stay in the conversation. I trust myself enough to pause, to question, to explore. It doesn't mean we always have to act immediately. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just acknowledge the feeling. Something doesn't feel right here, and I'm going to honor that, even if I don't fully understand it yet. That pause, that's where wisdom begins. That's where self-abandonment turns into self-connection. And here's what I've found time and again. When we start listening to ourselves more deeply, we show up differently in every relationship we're in. We're not waiting for someone else to validate what we already know. We're not outsourcing our safety. We're grounded. And from that grounded place, we can love more freely, speak more honestly, and live more courageously. So if your gut is whispering to you right now, if there's a part of you that's saying, pay attention, please don't silence it, that voice is not weakness. It's wisdom, and it's yours. So here we are. We've walked through the quiet, often hidden ways we abandon ourselves in relationships, not because we're broken, not because we're weak, but because we're human. We want love, we want connection, we want to feel safe, seen, and held. And sometimes in our longing for that love, we start to negotiate little pieces of ourselves away, softly, subtly, quietly, until one day we wake up and wonder why we feel so tired, so resentful, so unseen. But here's the truth I need you to hold on to. Real connection never requires your silence. Real love never asks you to shrink. And the relationships that are worth building, the ones that last and lift you and root you in truth, will never depend on you abandoning your boundaries, your voice, or your inner knowing just to keep the peace. Coming home to yourself in a relationship is not selfish, it's sacred. It's the foundation for any kind of love that's real and enduring. It's choosing to show up not as a version you think they'll accept, but as the full, complex, imperfect human you are, because you are worthy of that kind of love, not someday, not when you get it all right, but right now. So if you've recognized yourself in any of these patterns, don't shame yourself. This isn't about guilt. It's about awareness. And awareness is the beginning of every meaningful change. You don't have to fix it all overnight. Just start by noticing. Start by asking yourself, where am I disappearing in order to be loved? And then, one moment at a time, begin the journey back to yourself. Good luck on that journey. It's not always easy, but I promise it's worth it.